All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Kadin Stevens. I am a technical marketing engineer for Cisco's software-defined access solution team. I'm joined by some colleagues here today who are going to be joining me as question moderators. So please feel free at any point in time, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, drop them in the Q&A section and our team will answer. So looking at the agenda here today, I'll do a brief introduction about myself and a little bit about my background. I'll get into what is Cisco's software-defined access, and we'll touch on some terminology and roles in the fabric. Then we're an ISE webinar, right? So I'll answer the question, where does ISE come in into all of this? And we'll look at ISE integration with Catalyst Center. And I may slip up here and there because Catalyst Center was formerly called Cisco DNA Center. So if you see Cisco DNA Center anywhere, you know, it's a new change for all of us. So, and if I slip up and say it out loud, I'm only human. And then we'll get into group-based access control within Catalyst Center. And then time permitting, we'll have a review over everything we looked at today, and we'll close out. All right, so who am I? One more time, my name is Kadin Stevens. I'm a technical marketing engineer for Cisco Software Defined Access Solution Team. Born and raised here in California. I'm currently based out of Los Angeles. It's been pretty hot here. It's not pretty hot. A little bit about my educational background. I went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. It's located in Central California, right by the beach. Went there for my bachelor's in electrical engineering. I just got my CCNA a couple months ago. I got it in June at Cisco Live, so that was great. And I've been with Cisco for around 3 years. I started off as a hardware engineering intern working on the board-mounted power team. Then after that, I made a change over to TME land, and I became a rotational TME, rotated through routing, switching, and wireless platform solutions teams. And then after that rotation was finished, became a SDA TME, where you see me now today. Past couple years or so, I've done a lot of traveling and a lot of hiking. I've been to different countries, Switzerland, Portugal, Spain, England, and I really want to try to do some backpacking trips too as well throughout Europe. That'd be a dream one day. But regardless of all this background, I like to say the best part about me is that I have a 4-year-old son who is just the joy of my life, and he definitely keeps me on my toes. All right, so enough about me. I first want to pose a question to everyone here today. I want to ask, are you familiar with Cisco's SD-Access? So I want to hear if you're a beginner, if you're more on an intermediate or expert level, please let me know. Or, you know, you've been dealing with SD-Access for a while now, please feel free to share. There should be a Slido popping up on your screen momentarily. I am not seeing the Slido reader on my end, but I hope we're getting some great answers.
Yes,
some beginner. I see some chats. Cool. Awesome. Thanks for the chats, guys. Some people are new, intermediate. Great to hear. Okay. Awesome. So regardless of where your experience level is at, I hope to add on to that knowledge here today. So I'm glad we have a kind of a good spread of skill levels or knowledge levels in regards to SD-Access. So before we start talking about SD-Access, I first need to talk about Catalyst Center because that's where SD-Access lives in. So let's talk about that application. So Catalyst Center is a controller for access to secure, is a controller for secure access to networks and applications. And just at a high level, what Catalyst Center does is you can take control of your design for your network using physical maps and logical topologies for quick visual references. You can dive into policy and define user and device profiles. You can provision devices for policy-based automation, which we'll definitely touch on today. And there's an assurance aspect of it too as well. So you can provide deep insights and proactively optimize your network. And then just one more time, just for saying it, Cisco DNA Center is the former name. Now we are Catalyst Center. We have Catalyst Center. So what is Cisco's SD-Access? And we'll get into some terminology and roles. So Cisco's software-defined access tool is housed, again, in Catalyst Center. And what SD-Access does at a high level is a network architecture that revolves around three major pillars. The first pillar being automation. So we see our spinning Catalyst Center logo at the top there. And the next pillar being segmentation. So you see on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, our IoT network and our employee network has populated, attached to some extended nodes and some edge nodes. We'll get into that terminology in a little bit too as well, but that's part of our micro segmentation strategies. And then also the third pillar is centralized policy management, and we get a great deal of help from ISE. So we utilize tools within Catalyst Center like AI endpoint analytics to provide insights, visibility and insights into user and application experience. And we also integrate with ISE for our policy definitions and deploy our micro-segmentation strategies. So again, at a high level, the solution provides visibility-based and automated end-to-end segmentation to separate user, device, and application traffic without compromising on security and without redesigning the underlying physical network. That's what we're going to hit home on here today. So how do we deliver all these benefits without changing the underlying physical network? And the answer to that is an overlay. So what is an overlay? Now, the definition of an overlay is a logical topology used to virtually connect devices built over an arbitrary physical underlay topology. Your underlay is your existing physical network, and we use virtual extensible LAN, or VXLAN for short, but different examples of overlays, as you may have seen, are overlays like GRE, which you use to create VPNs, or CapWAP, which is very common in wireless networks, and you can use it to manage and control wireless access points. So we shouldn't be too unfamiliar to what an overlay is, because we've seen it in different technologies in different areas. So why an overlay? Well, again, it allows us to build on top of the underlying physical network without changing anything. We're able to scale out and create a virtually unlimited number of virtual networks. And this is valuable because of the ever-increasing number of devices, users, and applications we are trying to accommodate now. So that ties into what we'll talk about more later in regards to macro segmentation when we're talking about virtual networks. VXLAN is going to provide the logical connectivity, which enables users and devices to move across the network without having to reconfigure the physical network. So let's take a deeper look at this logical overlay that we have here. And we're going to transform it into something that we can get a little bit more familiar with, and it's going to change a little bit. And I'll transform it into what an SD-Access Fabric site looks like. And it's important to remember, as I'm going through Fabric site terminology and we're taking a look at the different types of what a Fabric site would look like, it's important to remember that it's still your underlying physical network that is there. Nothing has changed. All that we're doing now is virtualizing that so you can get all of these benefits. And we're changing the path throughout the network when we're virtualizing. So a Fabric site is a virtual topology overlay, as I've briefly mentioned before. And since it is a topology based on logic, it allows us to take a different path throughout the network, and we can develop and make different rules and services and policies compared to traditional networking because it's not tied to those underlay constructs as we talked about before. So we can have multiple Fabric sites, right? So this Fabric site that you see now on your screen, it could be the first of many different Fabric sites. And we can kind of take an overall look here. So a Fabric site can be defined by geographical locations or business logic, but that's not always the case. We can also define them by endpoint scale, failure, domain scoping, round trip time. This is all user defined. So whatever you feel like you need to define your Fabric site out for, you can define that and make it your own. They're typically connected by a transit. So let's go take a look at what a transit can look like. A transit connects these different fabric sites together, and they get connected together by a component in the SD-Access fabric called a transit control plane node. And they can be IP based, and you can use VRF Lite or MPLS, or you can also use SD-Access and Cisco SD-WAN, a little bit more native solutions too as well. You can use SD-WAN transit when your fabrics sites are in different regions across the globe, or Cisco SD-Access transit when your sites are in one major metropolitan area up to a couple hundred miles apart. Both the SDA transit and SD-WAN transit are going to provide you with consistent policy and end-to-end segmentation using virtual networks and security group tags, or SGTs. We'll talk about that more later. But those are the benefits over the typical IP-based transit. So let's take a little deeper look into what our fabric sites are going to look like. We've already talked about Catalyst Center earlier, and we know that it is the controller in which the SD-Access solution lies. And after a fabric site, border nodes are going to be the next kind of terminology we're going to look at here today. So border nodes are essentially the gatekeepers to your fabric site, and they control what traffic enters a fabric site and what exits a fabric site too as well. And they mitigate that traffic going back and forth. They also connect out to that transit control plane node that I was talking about earlier too as well. And so through the border node, through the transit control plane node, you're able to connect out to different fabric sites within your network. Let's take a look at our edge nodes here. So edge nodes, they're exactly what they sound like, right? They sit at the edge of your network and where your endpoints are. And they are devices that will typically authenticate and authorize endpoints via static assignments or features like .1x or MAB, which is MAC Authentication Bypass. And they do this with the help of ISE, given that ISE is the radius server in your environment. So edge nodes and border nodes as well, they're going to register endpoint IDs like IPv4, IPv6, and MAC addresses, and they'll register them with the control plane node that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So that registration information is going to be used throughout the fabric. Edge nodes also perform the encapsulation and decapsulation of traffic to and from all the wired connected endpoints. So let's take a look at our control plane node. You've heard me mention it a couple times here. So control plane nodes maintain a host tracking database to map location information. It receives registrations from the border nodes and the edge nodes, like I mentioned before, and also wireless LAN controllers too as well when you're dealing with wireless endpoints. It's the resolver when someone wants to know, hey, where is this endpoint at, right? And it is the one that performs the LISP lookup to find the destination endpoint ID, or that EID. And we'll take a look at that here in a second. The devices I've mentioned before are going to subscribe to the control plane node's LISP table. That's the LISP, LISP, talk about here coming up. And it's going to subscribe to learn new updates about the fabric, new registration endpoint IDs. And the control plane node is going to act as the publisher and publishes this information to its subscribers. So what is LISP? LISP stands for Location ID Separation Protocol. And what it does, it is a routing protocol that runs in the control plane of SD-Access, and it decouples the endpoint ID from its location in the network. It assigns an attribute called a RLOC, or a routing locator for short, to all the network devices at different locations within a fabric. And taking a look at LISP a little bit more in detail, or just a nice, quick, helpful analogy that we can look at. Imagine that you work for a company, right? Maybe we're all unfamiliar with that. No, we can look at that analogy and something that a little bit more relatable, right? I'm just joking around here. But so we can look at a company, and so overall, it could represent our overall network here. And we as people have IDs, and we have endpoint IDs or unique IDs that get us access to different branch locations, different locations across the globe, and they're in different locations. So of course they have different addresses or different RLOCs, different routing locators, if we want to kind of phrase it that way. And as we travel and go to different branch locations, we can get connected to different RLOCs. And this control plane node, what it does at a high level, it's going to keep track of where the endpoint RDs are navigating around to each different RLOC or each different branch site. So if an EID, if one endpoint wants to talk to another endpoint, they don't need to know each other's physical location. They just need to know the endpoint identifier. And they're going to query back up to the control plane and say, hey, where's this endpoint? And then the control plane will take care of that rest right there. All right, so let's expand this fabric out, right? So there's more to it. We can keep going. So we can expand this fabric out and add in optional components like devices like extended nodes that are going to extend the SD-Access fabric out and include and involve legacy devices that have hardware or software limitations that don't allow them normally to participate in something like this in a fabric on their own. We can make our fabric wireless enabled and add in wireless LAN controllers and our access points. And there are also intermediate nodes as well we can utilize that are not specifically a part of the fabric, but they do help to pass along data between fabric nodes. And of course, we have ISE, which is the star of the show here. And we use this in conjunction with SD-Access, and it is required actually to perform micro segmentation in an SD-Access fabric. So bouncing off what we just last talked about, where does ISE come in, right? We are in an ISE webinar. Where does ISE come in? We'll look at ISE integration with Catalyst Center too as well. So at a high level, these are all the different SD-Access, you can say, applications that we can really leverage ISE in, right? So today we're going to be mainly focused on group-based access control. I'm going to look at SDA micro-segmentation and security group tags and all of that fun stuff. But just know there are other applications you can use as well, like endpoint analytics and policy analytics. We'll take a look at. You can also use ISE for your host onboarding. A lot of great features when we bring in ISE. So as I'm sure you all know, ISE does an amazing job at policy distribution throughout the network. And we use ISE as the central policy engine and authentication authority. ISE can define and enforce access policies based on a user's identity, device type, and a whole bunch of other attributes, right? And Catalyst Center uses ISE for its group-based access control feature, which we'll check out a live demo for later in this presentation. So let's get in our first demo today. I have a couple of demos lined up for you all today so we don't get stir crazy. So let's check out our first one, being ISE integration. So I'll get logged into ISE here. And first, we're going to head over to Administration, System, and then Settings. And then on here on the left-hand side, I'm going to scroll down here to API Settings, and then click on API Service Settings. And what we're going to do here is enable ERS API calls, which are used for things like certificate exchanges and updating ISE with Catalyst Center, orchestrated group-based policies, or SGTs, and contracts. So I'll get this enabled here, press OK, and hit Save, and press OK once more. And now that that's done, we can go enable PX Grid too as well. So under Administration, go to System Deployment, and then click on our host name here. And something will come up for a brief moment. The FQDN is the fully qualified domain name. We need to take note of that because we're going to use it later. So PX Grid, PX Grid, Catalyst Center will subscribe to the PX Grid publisher, being ISE, in order to retrieve contextual data as well as SGTs. And so after that integration is complete, the security group tags from ISE are going to flood into Catalyst Center. So let's get this enabled. Scroll down and hit save. And now that that's all done here in ISE, we can now head over to Catalyst Center, but you'll see on the screen Cisco DNA Center for now. I'll get logged in here. And then first piece of steps we'll do is I'll head to System and then Settings. And then here on the left-hand side coming up, under External Services, we'll click on Authentication and Policy Servers, and we'll get ISE added in as a policy server. So I'll add ISE and fill out all my fun ISE information here on the right-hand side. And for the FQDN, mentioned it before, it's a fully qualified domain name. In my case, it's going to be admin.cisco.com. So I'll get that typed in here. Click on Advanced Settings to make sure I'm not missing anything. Yes, we do want to connect to the PX Grid publisher up there. And then Radius is selected as the protocol. We're not going to use TACACS today, but just know that it's available for authentication with your network devices. Everything else is default, and I'll click Add. And when we first go to do this, we are going to get a warning message that says, this is the first time Cisco DNA Center has seen the certificate from ISE, and it is not yet trusted. Do you want to accept the certificate and establish trust? Of course, I want to accept it. Let's keep going. And fast forward in time here, and now we have ISE that is fully integrated with Catalyst Center. So the next thing that I want to do here is set up some preliminary stuff. Assuming that you have a fresh Catalyst Center install, we'll head to Network Settings, and I want to put in some device credentials, specifically for CLI credentials, SNMP read and write. And what these credentials are going to help do are ensure that Catalyst Center, Cisco DNA Center, can fully manage our devices in our network. So I'll type in all the credentials here on the right-hand side. And I do want to assign the credential at a global level, so that way anything that I make in the network hierarchy that are parent to child relationships, everything gets assigned. I'll hit save. And we're going to do the same process for SNMP read and write too as well. So I'll kind of fast forward in time here. And make sure you're assigning to Site Global along the way. Now I'll head over to Network. And I want to add in ISE as a AAA server. So I'll click Add Servers in the top right-hand corner, click AAA, press OK. And then I'm going to select Client Endpoint because we're using Radius. And then under Servers, I'll click that I'm using ISE, select our ISE IP address, and ISE again as the PSN. Scroll down, everything else looks good, and I'll hit save. Cool, so now we fully have integrated ISE into Catalyst Center. The next piece of information I want to talk about with you all today is virtual networks in an SD-Access fabric. So all virtual networks do at a high level, right, are segment apart from each other so they do not conflict or communicate with one another. We can allow communication to happen within a virtual network, and you'll also hear me refer to it as a VN too as well, just for short. But we have to structure policies around this communication when we're communicating within a virtual network. There are two different types of virtual networks in the SD-Access fabric. There are layer 2 VNs, and there are also layer 3 virtual networks too as well. Layer 3 virtual networks, they're equivalent to VRFs, and VRF stands for virtual routing and forwarding. A VRF has its own routing tables and own forwarding rules, so you can deploy different VRFs for different purposes. You can deploy a campus VRF, a guest VRF. Whatever your purposes are, you're able to do it. And it's important to notate that VRFs do not talk to another VRF. So layer 3 virtual networks, since they're equivalent to one another, they don't talk to other layer 3 virtual networks. So we want to keep that macro segmentation piece going. There are also layer 2 virtual networks that are equivalent to VLANs, which provide the same high level of segmentation as VRFs, but they do this at, you guessed it, layer 2. So it's important to know that all wired and wireless endpoints, when they connect into an SD-Access fabric, have to connect into a virtual network. Regardless of anything, they have to connect into a virtual network. So Catalyst Center has some default VNs that we can deal with. The infra VN is for fabric access points and extended nodes. And there's also a default virtual network that someone can utilize too as well. And that's just for someone who doesn't necessarily want to utilize the macro segmentation piece of SD-Access, but they just want all their devices and everyone should just be encompassed under one virtual network. You can keep going and add and remove VNs as the needs for your network changes, and just know that we're flexible in that regard. So just want to get into a nice kind of visual representation of what I'm talking about in regards to macro and micro segmentation. So with macro segmentation, by default, our VNs are not going to communicate, as I've mentioned before. So we have on the left-hand side a virtual network for users and another one for our IoT things, right? By default, not going to communicate. And then we can take it a step further than this and look at micro segmentation. And we can split up within a virtual network and assign a group for employees, for contractors, and then on the IoT side of things, for your cameras, your fans, all of your IoT things, right? Essentially. So inside a virtual network, we can control what that communication looks like. As I mentioned before, we can deploy security group ACLs and say, hey, the employees and contractors can talk to each other, but maybe that level of communication looks different as far as IP traffic flow looks, right? And then we can take it another step further and say, okay, well, in my IoT things, in that virtual network, how the fans talk to the next fan, maybe I want to limit that communication. Maybe I don't even want to allow that communication at all. So you're able to control how the communication looks between security groups and within a security group too as well. And between how both pairs talk to each other, there are contracts or security group ACLs that happen. And it's important to remember, I've mentioned it before, I'll mention it again here, without ISE, you will not get any micro-segmentation with an SD-Access fabric. So with SGTs, right, traditionally it's been difficult to segment devices within the same VLAN or wireless devices within the same SSID, and SGTs can be assigned when hosts are onboarded to your network. They can be assigned to devices with certain attributes tied to them. And once a device gets onboarded into the network, ISE will process policy and provide an SGT for the device. These SGTs can also be extended to be used with other networking technologies like Cisco Secure Firewall and Cisco SD-WAN too as well. All right, so let's look at our next demo here, and we'll look at macro and micro segmentation within Catalyst Center. So I'll head over to policy, and we'll take our first look at group-based access control. It's going to ask us to start our migration from ISE into Catalyst Center, and we're going to migrate all the security groups over from ISE. So fast forward in time, migration has completed, and now we can go over to our security groups tab and take a look at all of our different security groups here. So I'll kind of scroll down here a little bit. We see auditors, contractors, employees, I've mentioned before, our guests, and they're all a part of the same default virtual network, which is default VN. So now I want to make some new virtual networks. So I'll head over to provision and then virtual networks. Press got it. And top right-hand corner, I'm going to click create virtual network. And the first one I'm going to do is for our campus. So I'll do campus VN. Hit save. And I'll create one more too as well. I'll create a guest virtual network for our guests. Hit save as well. And let's head back, right? So let's head back to policy, to group-based access control. And then if I go back to, excuse me, if I go back to security groups, all those different security groups that we just took a look at before, I can now assign them to different virtual networks, right? Because we don't want them, well, in our case scenario, we don't want them in the same virtual network. So let's split that up a little bit. I'll go into edit for our employees. And for the default virtual network, I'll go ahead and get rid of that. And I'll select our new VM that we just deployed. I'll select Campus VM. And I'll hit save now. All right, let's go ahead and do our contractors too as well. I want them also part of that campus virtual network. So hit edit, same process, get rid of the default virtual network, and hit campus. And save now again. And last but not least, I'm going to scroll down here until I see our guests. And I want them in their guest virtual network. So I'll get rid of default and click on guest. And save now. So after you've saved all these different configurations, important to hit deploy now. But let's take a look at everything we just did. Contractors and employees to the campus virtual network, guests to the guest virtual network. And you can do this for as many times as you need to. We'll go ahead and hit deploy now so our settings will save. All right, so we just took a look at macro and micro segmentation, and we take a step back for a moment and look at our Fabric site as a whole. It's important to understand how these network devices become their assigned role, right? So how did a border node become a border node? How does a control plane node become a control plane node? And the basic minimum requirements for a Fabric site is at least one control plane node, one border node, and one edge node. So we'll look at some Fabric provisioning in Catalyst Center and assigning these node types. But just remember that our underlay is still here, right? Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed or is changing in your physical underlay. We are now virtualizing and just assigning different roles to different devices. And if you want to see if your devices are compatible for an SD-Access Fabric, you can head to cs.co/SDA compatibility matrix and see if your devices are compatible. All right, so let's get into our Fabric provisioning. So in Catalyst Center, these are all my network devices that are in my inventory. So I've imported them into Catalyst Center. I can select like devices and provision devices to a site. And we're going to put them to floor 1 and building 22 here. Look at a summary for everything we're doing and apply and deploy our devices. And they've been provisioned to that site. I'm going to fast forward in time here and select our other like routers. And they've also been provisioned to building 22 to floor 1. I could change our focus in Catalyst Center. Instead of looking at inventory, I can look at provision and take a look at all my provisioned devices. Kind of scroll down here and I see that the provisioning status, everything says successful. So I know I'm able to proceed over to start creating my Fabric site. So I'll head over to provision and then under SD-Access, we'll go Fabric sites. And let's create our first site together. Let's do it. So I want building 22 to be my Fabric site. And there are also 2 floors attached to building 22 in the hierarchy, but that's okay. So click next. And for wired endpoint data collection, let's proceed on. authentication template, I'll click close authentication for now. And I'll set up some things called some fabric zones. I'll set that up later, and you can check that out in maybe a future webinar presentation. Hit deploy. All right, so the Fabric site has been fully provisioned and fully deployed. So let's go check out our Fabric site details. So we see our Fabric site here, building 22. Let's take a look at what this looks like on the inside. So we see we have our border nodes and our edge nodes there on the bottom. And we can start assigning some roles. But before we do that, take a look at post onboarding, and go under virtual networks. And we want to assign our virtual networks that we just made to this Fabric site, right? So we want the Fabric site to have access to these different virtual networks. So I'll select campus, guest, and infra virtual network. We'll go back here to Fabric infrastructure. Excuse me. And let's assign our 9500 here and as a control plane node and a border node. So I'll select LISP pub sub. LISP BGP is another option, but LISP pub sub gives you great benefits in regards to SDA. And I'll select it also as a border node. So you can co-locate a border node and a control plane node together. You can even co-locate a border node, control plane node, and an edge node all in one. And that's something known as a Fabric in a box. But for now, I'll select my 9300s here at the bottom and enable them as our edge nodes. And I'll also select this other one too as well. Okay, now that that's done, we'll hit deploy and then apply. Make sure everyone gets their roles. And now we see that we have border node, control plane node co-located on the 9500 and our two edge nodes here at the bottom too as well. I'll head back to host onboarding and then go to virtual networks and head into my campus virtual network. And I want to add in a IP address pool so that way there can be some communication in my campus virtual network. I'll select my campus IP address pool and I'll give it a VLAN name. So I'll select put campus 1. As a traffic type, I can select data or voice. I'll select data and click add. And after that's done, I can take a look at a summary of how I've configured my IP address pool for my virtual network and click deploy and then apply. And it's loading here, and now it's turned blue to recognize, so we can recognize the IP address pool has successfully been attached to that campus virtual network. All right, let's get into a look into group-based access control. A little bit more in depth. So I want to provide a before and after, right? A before and after comparison between using the Cisco TrustSec architecture versus using the SD-Access architecture. I won't spend too much time here on the comparisons except to provide you with the key differences between the two. So first off, with using either Cisco TrustSec or SDA, you're going to be able to utilize security group tags across your devices so we can strengthen our micro-segmentation strategies, right? But what it comes down to between the two is how easy do you want your life to be when you go to do this, frankly. So with TrustSec, you'll have to make sure on a hop by hop basis that each device even supports TrustSec along the way, and that you're going to run it, and that you're not going to run into any hardware or software limitation issues. And then if you do have a device that doesn't support TrustSec, you'll have to use the SGT exchange protocol or SXP for short, on that device so it can pass along SGTs. Assuming that all works out for you, and you'll have to manually configure for SGTs because there's not an automation aspect to using Cisco TrustSec on its own. So let's move forward to the SD-Access architecture, right? So with the SDA architecture, you can get everything you just had with TrustSec, but better. You're able to fully automate your SGT configurations from Catalyst Center, and you don't need to make sure each and every device supports SGTs along the way, because we know now that we're dealing with an overlay, so we're able to propagate that SGT along the way via a different path throughout the network than it would have taken previously. This also scales out more since we're now virtualizing everything. So with Catalyst Center policy and managing group-based policy, managing group-based access control policies within Catalyst Center, we can kind of take a look at a couple of differences here real quick. So managing policy in Catalyst Center will notate that ISE is read-only, you get a single matrix, and single security group ACLs per policy. When managing policy on Cisco ISE, there is no matrix view, and then you get, multi-matrix compared to the single matrix that you would have gotten on Catalyst Center, and there's multiple security group ACLs per policy. So those are some of the differences there. Okay, so we'll get into our group-based access control live demo here. So I'm in Catalyst Center. I'll give everything a quick refresh, make sure we're good. And then within Catalyst Center, let me start from the beginning here. Beginning dashboard. Top left-hand corner, head over to policy, and then group-based access control. And then the first stop that I want to make here is we can head into security groups. And this has now evolved, right, from what we've seen earlier was kind of the bare bones of it all, but now this setup has a lot more to look at. So we can see our source security groups here on the left-hand side and our destination security groups here on the right-hand side. And we can look at different flows going across. So different communication between the source security group and a destination security group. We can take a look within this flow and see what is being allowed. I'm going to zoom out a little bit, guys. There we go. Probably a lot better for everyone to see. And we can look at what's being exchanged back and forth between the two security groups and what is also just one directional. And it looks like with this security group going from developers to guests, I'm only having some one directional traffic here that we can see as I scroll down. And so if head back, here we go. So if members within these groups are communicating with each other, that's when the flow interaction is going to be displayed on this screen. And we'll see on the top right-hand corner, we have this nice clock that we can take a look at the communication and what the flow has been looking like within a 24-hour, 12-hour, 1-hour period. Heading over to policies. We could take a nice look at this policy map. I'll go to full screen here. And if you're familiar with ISE, you're familiar with a policy map. So we can have this nice policy map view in Catalyst Center, and we can take a look at a high level, what is being denied traffic across, what's being permitted traffic across, and also some custom traffic flows that we've created too as well. So we'll see that from the contractors to, let's say, the cameras, we're denying all IP traffic, right? And from the bidirectionally, so from the contractors to the cameras, denying traffic, but let's say the contractors want to take a look at their cameras and everything like that, and have communication with that, we are permitting that IP traffic. Okay, so I'll go ahead and switch back over. And we'll get into some review. So we've kind of reached the end of the presentation here. I'll get into, at a high level, everything that we've discussed today. So with the SD-Access Fabric, we first talked about our different roles within a fabric, border nodes, control plane nodes, and edge nodes too as well. It doesn't stop there. You're welcome to look up. I have some resources at the end if you want to take a deeper dive into the different type of node types that you can deal with. But at macro segmentation level, we looked at layer 3 virtual networks, and we know that they're equivalent to VRFs, and which meaning that they have their own routing table, so they're not going to have communication back and forth with each other. But once you bring in ISE, you can also have a microsegmentation strategy too as well, and control how the communication looks within these different security groups that we can have. We can have different security groups for lighting and for cameras, and for our guests, employees, and contractors. We can structure policies around how we want that communication to look like. So we talked about group-based access control and macro and micro segmentation, and we've also looked at our policy analytics too as well to see that group-to-group interaction with automated policy. And that piece was looking at that nice flow matrix that we were looking at just now for the live demo, and also looking at that policy map at a high level. What is being permitted across from group to group, what's being denied, and I can get into some custom attributes too as well. So moving forward and having some different steps here too as well. This is a use case scenario for the individual or company that would like to have consistent policies across other Catalyst Center clusters in your network. And you could deploy one cluster as your author, excuse me. And as of today, you can also deploy 4 other clusters to be your reader, which duplicates the author's policies, but deploys them to their own set of network devices. This feature is called mDNAC. It means multiple multiple DNA centers to ISE. But of course, it's been formerly known as DNA Center, now Catalyst Center. I mentioned I was going to slip up a couple of times, so that's okay. But feature is called mDNAC to ISE, or multiple DNA center to ISE. And we can continue on. Excuse me. And so our readers will duplicate the author's policies, and it can deploy them to their own set of network devices. So you can expand this out and scale this out, right, from your author and say, hey, now I want to bring in some different networks and some different network devices. Here are my different clusters. Let's go ahead and keep the same end-to-end segmentation and policies going to these different clusters. We looked at a high level the different ISE use cases with SD-Access. A lot of great benefits here. We focused on the group-based access control benefit here today. And we also took a look at some policy analytics. I'll kind of pause here on this slide for a moment. If you want to check out our CVD, our design tool, which is new too as well, you can go in and enter in your network information, and it will actually recommend different topologies and different for your network. So you can look at compatibility matrix within it too as well, and it will say, hey, this is what can be used as a border node and control plane node. And then also, if you don't want to use the tool to see what devices are compatible for SD-Access Fabric, you can go into our compatibility matrix and check that out too as well. All right, Rico, this ends my presentation. Thank you all for being here today. And if time permitting, maybe we can get into some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that presentation, Kadin. That was great. Before we wrap up, we do have just a few questions remaining, so we can go ahead and take care of those before we end it for today. So jumping into the first question, is the VN assigned in an ISE authorization profile just like you'd assign a VLAN?
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. Is the VN assigned in an ISE authorization profile just like you'd assign a VLAN?
I'm trying to kind of maybe for another team member if they can want to take this one. A virtual network, you can at a high level. Go ahead, Alex. Go for it.
You don't assign virtual network in ISE authorization profile. You
Yeah.
can either attach it to the VLAN or attach it to the IP pool.
Yeah, there we go. And then so virtual networks at a high level can be assigned in Catalyst Center. That's for the high level segmentation of that. And then as far as what we're bringing over from ISE into Catalyst Center is that migration of all the different security groups that you can have from ISE into Catalyst Center to use for your micro segmentation.
Perfect. Thank you both so much for that. Next question. If ISE is controlling the TrustSec policy, can I assign the virtual network in an ISE authorization profile just like you'd assign? Oh, you know what? I'm sorry.
This is a repeat of the
Yeah, it's the same
previous
question. Apologies for that.
No
All right, so we do have a final question here that we'll jump into. Will every cluster have a VIP or will use every member's IP?
Can you repeat it one more time, please?
Yes.
Thanks, Rigo.
Will every cluster have a VIP or will we use every member's IP?
That's a good question. I do not know the answer to that, but another team member can try to
I
take
believe
that too as well.
somebody from DNAC platform maybe can answer that, but as far as I know, it uses the VIP for the cluster.
Yeah, that's
every cluster would require a VIP because if you start with a single cluster and you later add 2 more DNAC to the cluster, so when you build the cluster or with a single member or multiple members, you would define the virtual IP address. So it requires the VIP.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
cool. Thank you.
Excellent. And we just had one final question that came in now, and that question is, in a group of companies, can a Catalyst cluster be configured in each one and use the same ISE?
Yes. So in a group, can you repeat it again? That's our multiple DNA center to ISE feature, if that's what that's referring to. Can you ask the question again one more time, please?
Yes, absolutely. In a group of companies, can a Catalyst cluster be configured in each one and use the same ISE?
Yes. Yeah, that's our multiple DNAC to ISE feature. So you can have one cluster be the author, and then now I think starting up to Catalyst Center 223, version 223, you can have 4 other clusters be the reader, and they will read in the author's policies and different security groups that you have with those policies too as well. And they can read that in and have a consistent experience across the different clusters. But if you want to structure some different policies too as well, I believe you would have to set up a different cluster and a different set of clusters for that purpose.
And if DNAC is not driving the group by policy, you can have multiple DNAC clusters being integrated with a single ISE deployment, more than 5. But you don't drive the group by policy from Catalyst Center at this point. You drive it from the ISE. So that's a distinction.
Yeah, so my case scenario that I just spoke to is when Catalyst Center is driving, is the point of configuration is driving that. That's where my use case scenario was going. But you don't have to have Catalyst Center, what Alex was just saying, you don't have to have Catalyst Center be that point of where you're going to be managing your policies from. You can still use ISE to manage the policies going across.